All right, welcome to this week's podcast, an episode of our show, True Data Ops. I'm your host, Kent Graziano, the Data Warrior. Each week, we will bring you a podcast covering all things data ops with the people that are making data ops what it is today. My guests this week are Randy Bean and Allison Sagraves. Randy's the founder, CEO, innovation fellow, senior advisor, thought leader, author, there's the book, speaker, and board member. He is the best-selling author of this great book, Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data, and AI. He's also a contributor to Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and MIT Sloan Management Review. Allison is a recognized authority on data analytics and strategy and advises many startups, companies, and on data monetization and strategies therein. As an early chief data officer in industry, she helped define the role and has achieved international recognition, being named as a 2022 Top 100 Global Data and Analytics Innovator, 2022 Top 50 Data and Analytics Leader, and 3-time Global Data Power Women, among many other awards. Allison is a founding faculty member of the Carnegie Mellon University Chief Data and Analytics Officer program, where she's now both a faculty member and an advisor. And then in her spare time, she's also an advisor to my friends at DataOps.live. Now, I could go on about both of these guys, but that would take like the entire podcast just to go over all the things that these two have achieved. So I'm going to get going here, and welcome to our show, Allison and Randy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you.
So we could talk about so many things. There's so much happening in the data world these days, and you both are like right in the middle of it all the time and have been for quite a few years. But recently you wrote an article for CDO magazine about reinventing the role of the CDO, Chief Data Officer. So want to start off with a little bit of like, why did you write that article, and what's changed in our industry that makes you think that the role needs to be reinvented?
Well, I'd be happy to go first. Let me share with you a little bit of data, because for the past dozen years, we've been conducting a survey of Fortune 1000 organizations and their top executives. Roughly 85% of the respondents have been chief data officers or chief data and analytics officers. And it's interesting to note that when we first conducted the survey in 2012, only 12% of organizations had appointed a chief data officer, whereas this year, 82.6% of organizations had. So that tells you a few things. Clearly, it's a new role. When the CIO role, Chief Information Officer role, was first established a generation ago, people used to joke and say that CIO stood for career is over, because there was so much uncertainty and not a clear blueprint. So CDOs face a number of challenges, and Allison, having sat in that chair, can certainly speak to them, very directly.
Yeah, I would just add that, in the past few months, as I've been meeting with chief data officers across industries and kind of around the world, everyone thinks that no matter what they're doing, they're not doing enough. And I think people have a real complex in this industry. And, Randy's data kind of supports it, because I think the majority of chief data officers, I actually took this survey when I was in the role, would report that they're achieving some value with data. But I think it's something like fewer than 20% of people that answered the survey say that they have a data culture. So I think that, so much has been invested in this space. There's so much discussion about, data ops, data products. So I think that, Randy and I talked, and we thought we really need to encourage people to be much more business focused, much more aligned to what's important to the business, and what are the strategic priorities of any company, and that's where data should be prioritized. It's not a separate thing. The CDO should not be separate from the business, but I think one of the true data ops principles is collaboration. Really, the chief chief data officer is a chief collaboration officer to really enable the business to use data to advance the goals of the company. And I can give some examples. I just think that the talk in this industry is too abstract, too theoretical, and we've really just got to be much more practical about things people can do, starting today, starting this month, to really help their business partners achieve value.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that, just to add to the point that Allison made, just want to share some additional data. We asked, are you driving business innovation with data? 5 years ago, 59% said yes. This year, 59% said yes. So no improvement. Are you competing with data and analytics? 5 years ago, 47% said yes. This year, 40% said yes. So actually it declined. Have you created a data-driven organization? 5 years ago, 31% said yes. This year, only 23%. And lastly, have you established a data culture? 5 years ago, 28% said yes. And this year, only 20% said yes. So it points to the fact that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And one of the things that I preach to organizations when they ask is, if they're not getting measurable business value from their data investments, they really need to step back and rethink what they're doing.
Yeah, so that's interesting that those percentages went down over the last couple of years when you're doing your survey. Is that the result of maybe we have a better understanding of what that means to have a data-driven culture, and they're realizing that, well, we actually really haven't achieved it? Or is something else changing that's causing those numbers to back down?
Just quickly, in answer to your question, it could be many things. You don't know for sure, but I actually believe, and this is a good piece of good news, is that there's a greater realism. And people before were maybe optimistic, and when the CDO role was first established, there was the assumption. Certainly, many executives said, "Oh, well, we appoint a chief data officer, therefore we're data-driven." Right. And over time, people have said, "Well, there really is a lot of work to do. There's a huge change management element involved, changing business processes, changing skill sets, getting buy-in from the organization." So I think it's a greater realism, and that's a good thing. That's a maturing factor.
I also think that people keep raising the bar on what good looks like. And one of the reasons we wrote this article was when I was talking to some CDOs these were Fortune 100 global companies. I would say, what are you doing in the data space that's, helping your customers, helping your business partners? And they would give great examples. And then they would say, but, we haven't achieved a data culture. So, I found this sort of duality, interesting, that no matter what people had achieved, they thought they weren't doing a good job. So I just think that there just needs to be much more, business focus, partnering with the business on on critical objectives, and less sort of abstract talk about everybody's got to be trained in the company, and all of these things that I think make people feel that they've never done enough. I think we shouldn't talk about enough. We should talk about what's important, and we just need to be much more focused. I think that was one of the first points we put in our article, is relentless prioritization.
And a story I often tell, and it's a oversimplification and generalization, but it makes the point. And that is, as I described, that I go into many organizations and meet with data leaders, and they talk about all the capabilities that they've created. And I say, wow, this is amazing. Good for you. And I meet with the technology leaders, and they talk about the engineering and the architecture and the platforms they put in place. And I say, this is very impressive. And they meet with the line of business leaders, and they say, hey, we don't trust the data that we're getting. We're not getting the data that we need to make the decisions that are important to us. We're not getting the data we need in a timely fashion. So this points to this gap between expectations and what's happening on the ground. And to Allison's point, the more that there's strong business sponsorship, and data leaders and technology and business leaders can work hand in hand, the greater the probability of a successful outcome.
Yeah, and so what do you see this question here from Jeff Jacobs? Could it be that there's a higher volume of newer companies responding to your survey, that they haven't made the progress because they're just getting started?
Well, so I just answer in a couple different ways. They're all Fortune 1000 companies, or the equivalent to Fortune 1000 companies, and across industries, roughly 57% are major financial services firms, 16% from healthcare, 10% from retail and consumer goods, 5% from media and entertainment, and 12% from all other. But to that point, they're all at different stages of maturity. Some are on their first iteration of a chief data officer, and some, in the case of major banks, you won't believe this, are actually on their seventh person to sit in the CDO role.
Wow. That's a lot of churn. And I remember the days of the CIO being, kind of the career ending thing, that people were going, the average life expectancy of a CIO was like 18 months, right? And so you were constantly, are you seeing the same thing in those industries with the CDO, that they're not, for a variety of reasons, I'm sure, that they're not getting the longevity to actually build that data culture and keep the momentum going? If you're changing the leadership that frequently, it seems like that might be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, I'll comment on that briefly. Tom Davenport and I wrote in Harvard Business Review an article a year ago that said the average tenure of a chief data officer was roughly 20 to 24 months. And exactly to your point, with that type of turnover, it's hard to sustain any type of momentum or progress. It seems that organizations are often going back and forth. We've been asked about whether the chief data officer is a internal person that knows the business well or an outside change agent, and those numbers seem to vary from year to year as well.
So this is one of the things that I've been curious about, because I've seen different answers to it, is where should the CDO report? I mean, thinking that we want to have this, it really needs to be tied into the business. Who does the CDO report to? Do they report to a CFO? Do they report to a CIO? Do they report to the CEO or the COO? Where's the best place for them to live?
I'll comment briefly and then let Allison weigh in. But one of the questions that we asked this year was, who does the CDO report to versus past years? And for the first time, 43% of the respondents said that the chief data officer reported to the president, CEO, or chief operating officer, which was a huge step up in terms of seat at the table. Because when we asked this question in previous years, 5 years and before that, most of them reported to the chief information officer. So there's really been a shift in many organizations for the chief data officer becoming a peer of the CIO. And I'd love to hear Allison's real world perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think in some ways it kind of doesn't matter. I think what matters is that the role has stature, that the person has influence, and is very tightly connected to the business. I think people get a little tripped up on, well, does it report here? Does it report there? People can be successful reporting anywhere if the organization is, if the person has authority and has good partnerships with the business. So I don't think that's so critical.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the key. My experience from my career has always been that is, I can't do what you want me to do if you don't give me the authority to do it. So somehow you have to be empowered, right? To make, because some of these are fairly drastic changes for organizations to introduce a data culture and really build that synergy between the technology side and the business side in order to be successful. And without the authority, that's, how are they going to be able to achieve that?
I think you need, you basically need a team of leaders, and this gets to the culture, but you need the business savvy. You need people who are curious about the business and think about the business in quantitative terms, data terms. You need technology people who understand how to provide the infrastructure to enable people to use data. So it's not like one person that makes this happen. I think now, like the CDOs, I think if they're if they have a strong domain expertise, they know what's possible, and they have good relationships in the business, they can kind of corral people, into these teams, like in DataOps principles, like collaborate, in small groups and really focus on real business problems. I think I saw last week that there was a startup that's focusing on helping companies look at their customer data to figure out which customers are going to churn. And I thought to myself, people are agonizing about having a data culture. Like, your first order of business should be to understand who your customers are. Like, if you're not doing that with data and understanding who are your customers, who might likely be, about to leave. I mean, these are very easy things to do with data. And, I think people just need to start with some basic problems like this, build some traction, get some real value, and just incorporate data into everyday decision-making. I think we make it too complex. I think there's so much press about you have to scale, and now everything is AI every single day, that you just have a constant inferiority complex. I mean, I would just challenge anybody out there. I hope you know who your customers are. I hope you know the ones that are the most profitable. I hope you're taking care of them. And I hope you know the ones that are about to leave and you're doing something about that. If you're not doing that with your data, you have bigger problems.
One thing
that's true.
Well, one thing that I might add to that is something that we've seen a sharp increase in recent years is companies and data leaders focusing on what we characterize as offensive activities versus defensive. Defensive being regulatory compliance and risk, offensive being business growth, customer generation, customer treatment, creation of new markets, expansion into new markets and creating new products. And we're seeing more and more of that, particularly, it's worth noting that particularly in non-financial services industries, for example, among consumer goods and retailers, to a significant degree, they're in fashion businesses, so they have to be attuned to change, and hence they're spending a greater portion of their time on business growth activities.
Yeah, that makes sense. So from your perspective, looking at the role of the CDO, what responsibility do they have for like implementing or adopting things like true data ops approach, agile, data culture? How much of it is them and how much of it is other parts of the organization to really try to get these things going?
I mean, I think that they are the leader in that, lead influencer and collaborator. I think making people aware that hey, we can make an impact quickly, and I think really just championing agile principles from everything from the procurement process to how we get tools, to how we make data accessible to businesses, to working with the business on focus problems. I think that the good thing now about being a CDO is technology is not the barrier. I mean, when I started out in 2015, it was a different, the technical landscape was much different. I mean, yes, it's complicated. There's lots of tools, but the good news is you should be able to get up and running, in a matter of days, to be able to do something impactful. So I think it's up to the CDO to really, inspire and get people moving on something that's important to the business. So I do think that that's an important role of the CDO is to be a champion, evangelist, I guess is a word people use a lot, but to really lead the charge and to accelerate the charge and really, kind of focus on speed. And as Randy wrote a whole book, fail fast. I mean, we have to accept that we're not going to get things perfect, but done is better than perfect, and learning and iterating. That's how you expand and scale and ultimately create a data culture. But you got to get off the dime.
Yeah, and this is a question for you, Randy, from your experience there and writing that book, Fail Fast. What's the main barrier for people being able to kind of adopt that mindset where it's okay to fail as long as we're making progress?
Yeah, that's a question, a big question with a lot of different answers. One of those answers is to Allison's point that consistently, when we ask people what's the biggest barrier to success, it's not technology. Roughly 90% respond it's cultural issues, people issues, change. When major banks have operated for a certain way for generations or well over 100 years, to expect them to become data driven overnight, it's a process. So on the one hand, organizations have to plan for the long term and they have to stick with it and be resilient and persistent, but they need to try things along the way. They need to experiment and see what works. And if something doesn't work, they need to move on to the next thing. And working closely with business partners, because if they can show success in solving one business problem or asking one business question, that starts to establish that trust. And if you repeat it again, you further deepen that trust and it establishes credibility. And then the more you cycle through that, it starts to establish momentum. But if you don't have that trust from the outset, it's hard to make any meaningful progress.
Yeah. So how do you have any advice for folks on how to go about getting the business or the CDO or whoever it is to actually make the investment necessary to achieve some of these cultural changes? Some of it's training, some of it's coaching, some of it's mentoring, but how do you get them off the dime to do that and make the, I'll say, an appropriate level of investment as opposed to just throwing a little bit of money at it and throwing a couple people to a class?
I have one quick answer to that, and that is speak business terms and not jargon, because there's too much jargon and often it winds up turning the business people off because they have to go and look up what it is that's being said, and it makes them feel that they're not being treated respectfully. And everybody is in business, so unless you can speak in terms of business outcomes, it's hard to establish credibility. And I remember a story from about a decade ago where a data leader came to me and they related that they went to the president of the company and they said, I need $25 million for an MDM project. And the president of the company said, request denied, because I don't know what MDM is. And until you can come back to me and speak in a language that I understand and what's the specific benefits, that I'm not interested.
I'll kind of elaborate on that. I spoke with the CDO a couple months ago, and he said, if I had it to do over, I would have spent my time building relationships with the business, talking their talk. And then he gave an example of a very specific project that he did with in commercial banking to identify customers who were the next most likely product to sell in the commercial bank. And he, working with a business partner, he found a pain point that they had and addressed that pain point. And it was a really interesting story. And basically he said, I've spent all this time trying to get everybody on board, but I really should have been focused on building these relationships and understanding the business problems and, tackling things kind of like, one at a time. I mean, obviously you can ultimately end up doing things multiple at a time. But, I think to your point, what should people do today? I think really just have conversations with the business, find out what are their problems? What do they need help with? And then, get them some data, get them up and running in the next, 1 to 2 weeks and get moving on something. I think we've overcomplicated, we've over-engineered so much of this that I think there's a fear element. And I think, plenty of foundations have been built that can be leveraged for the purpose of delivering business value. So I'd say get off the dime, go meet with your most trusted business partner and identify a problem that you can start working on in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, and data can be scary to people too. I mean, sometimes people don't like what the data has to say. So, that's why it's really important to have those relationships so that you can provide some context so that people will become more accepting of the information that's coming to them.
Yeah. And I think you're hitting on a lot of points that I think are actually kind of buried in the Agile Manifesto and the principles of Agile. Work daily with the business. Have the the product owners should be from the business. The backlog should be prioritized by the business, but that means we have to be able to communicate that to the business in terms that they understand. And like I say, speaking about what's the business problem we're trying to solve. It's not a technology problem, right? It's a business problem. We can throw all the technology in the world we want at things and all these great methodologies and all of that, but if we're not addressing a business problem that resonates with the business, well, you're not going to get the investment, right? We're not going to get the funding to actually do this and make progress towards those goals.
Yeah, I think I was going to say on the whole topic of agile, it's really to me, it's an agile spirit. It's an agile way of thinking. It's an agile way of acting. And it's less about the methodologies and the manifestos and all this stuff. And it's act agile, like walk the walk, spend less time focusing on all the terminology and just behave in an agile way. That's what I think.
Just a quick aside, I just completely independently, I happened to be reading a book a few weeks ago about the building of the transcontinental railroads in the United States. And that was a very transformative technology thing. But the end result was people cared about that it got us to our destination faster. They didn't care about what type of gauge was used on the rails or how many miles of rails were laid down. So, there's lessons to be learned from history.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We, myself, primarily in the technology side of the world, we spend a lot of time talking about the technology, talking about the approach, talking about, true data ops, Scrum, Agile, Lean, whatever it is, rather than what are we going to achieve, right? And the business doesn't, I've made this argument for years with a lot of people, the business doesn't necessarily need to know what modeling technique you're using or what database you're using. They just need to see that you are helping them solve a problem that makes the business more efficient, makes it more profitable, whatever the goals of the organization are. And as technology, IT people, this has been a struggle for, I don't know, I'll say 4 decades that I've been doing it, of trying to get people to see. And like you said, I think your message there, Randy, was great. It's like, get rid of the jargon. You need to use business terminology. You need to talk to the business people in a language that they understand, right? It's not about all the tools and the technology. It's about, the goals of the business and how we're going to help them achieve that. And maybe it is with the true data ops approach, with an agile Scrum approach, but throwing those terms out too soon, when they say, how did you do it? How were you so successful? Well, maybe we can explain it then, but do they really need to know these particular technical terms that we use to actually go about doing our work?
Well, I think we swap out every, 24 months, we have a new set of terms, new vocabulary.
Yeah.
We swap out the vocabulary, but we don't change the behaviors. So now everybody needs to be a data product owner, which I don't disagree with. I think that is a good direction. But we just relabel things, but we haven't changed we haven't changed the contents. So what does it mean to be a data product owner? And now it's kind of industry. There's a whole cottage industry. Every university is now having training in being a product owner, which, is probably a good thing.
Probably.
But, what does it take to be a product owner? Now you're just changing somebody's label. Now they're a product owner. What does that actually mean? I think about that. Launching a new product is kind of a big deal. Like I said this before, if we were good at doing that, we would have all launched a product and started a business. It's actually hard to launch a product. It's actually hard to launch something that's commercially viable. We'll have customers that are willing to pay for it. So suddenly we're just going to label everybody product owners and expect that we're going to have success. I mean, I think we just need to be more practical about, more pragmatic about what we're doing and get away from all of this buzzword jargon. I'm not saying that we don't need to change roles and realign to some extent. We obviously do, but I think we're too superficial in our approach.
Yeah, I think that's right up there with organizations. And I worked in one where they basically said, we're going to become an agile engineering organization, 2-week deliveries. Because it's 2-week iterations. Thou art agile. Let's go. And yeah, no, that didn't work out real well. So we do have to think about these things. Like, yeah, we can put all the labels on it we want, but we really have to understand the approach. Well, we've used up our time very quickly here with the two. This has been awesome. I have a traditional question I like to leave just to kind of change our mind again. If you weren't involved in data and technologies like this, what would you do? So I'll start with Allison.
I would be spending all of my time where I am right now in my forest with my bees and planting my new orchard. And so I'm out here a lot. I'm out here a lot more than I used to be, but I think I'd do that full time.
Oh, that's great. I know we need bees, we need pollinators, and we definitely need fruit. So I'm down with that. That's great. Randy, what about you?
Yeah, when I was in college, I wanted to be a writer or a rock star. And my career got to a point that I could actually start writing about things. And in a teeny tiny community, sometimes I'm a little bit of a rock star.
Awesome. That's great. I love it. So, well, thank you both for being the guests on our show today. And thanks for everyone who's joined in on our live stream and those of you who are going to watch the recording of this. Be sure to join us next time as I'm going to be chatting with Snowflake data superhero and expert architect, Frank Bell. So until then, have a great week. And don't forget to like these podcasts and the YouTube videos that go with them, and tell all your friends about the True Data Ops podcast. So this is Kent Graziano, the Data Warrior, signing off for now.